Let's face it, there's not a lot that goes into making Scotch whisky, at least in terms of the basic ingredients. Under the Scotch Whisky Association's regulations, distillers can only use 3 things to make whisky. That's water, yeast, and malted barley. There's no additives, no flavourings, nothing else is allowed. But it's the time that the spirit spends maturing in oak casks that brings the majority of whisky's distinctive flavour. From harsh raw spirit to a delicate and mesmerising dram, how can we achieve such an immense variety of flavours by simply letting this liquid lie in some oak for years on end? Don't worry, because we're about to unravel this essential part of the whisky making process so you can fully understand what's in your glass and maybe impress your pals the next time you share a dram. Might as well pour a wee dram while we get started. Now, everyone has their own idea of the actual extent of maturation's influence on the final flavour of a whisky, but most people in the industry will agree that it's about 60% or maybe even a bit more. That influence will vary dramatically depending on what the cask was used for before. It might have previously held bourbon or a type of sherry, a sweet wine, beer, or even rum. Whatever the previous contents were will have seeped into the wood, and then that will influence the whisky that's maturing in the same cask. But there's also a bit of a sense of maturation being something of a black art, where mysterious kind of unseen processes are at work over a number of years, with hidden developments of oxidation, addition, subtraction, which all play a role in shaping the colour and the character of the whisky that ends up in your bottle and then in your glass. Whatever is going on has a profound sensory impact on the cask as flavours are added, removed, or changed. But what do we really know about what's going on inside the cask? Well, what you're starting out with, you've got to remember, isn't whisky at all. It's considered new make spirit for the first 3 years after it comes off the still, and it can't legally be called Scotch until it's 3 years old. There are all kinds of factors that then come into play when it comes to influencing flavour during the maturation process. As we mentioned, these include what was previously in the cask that is soaked into the wood, as well as the species of oak, how it's coopered or made into a cask, how big the cask is, and also how many times it's been used. That's all before you take into consideration factors like the warehouse environment, how casks are stored, what the temperature's like, and of course, how long the whisky is left to mature. Scotland's climate and its cool dunnage warehouses are ideal for lengthy periods of maturation, where the evaporation known as the angel share averages out at just about 2% per year. That's in comparison with a tropical climate such as Taiwan, which can be up to 12% a year, and for a distillery in the Middle East such as Milk and Honey, it can be as much as 25% of the contents of the cask, which is disappearing over the course of just 1 year. So what kind of casks are actually being used to mature whisky? Well, the vast majority. So what kind of casks are actually being used to mature whisky? Well, the vast majority come from the US bourbon industry, with about 90 to 95% of Scotch matured here in Scotland in casks made of American white oak that have previously been used to make bourbon. It's a fortunate advantage for Scotch distillers that in the US a law was introduced after Prohibition ended that made it illegal for a bourbon cask to be used more than once. There's a whole other story to explore behind the reasons for that and how it changed the way that Scotch was matured, but the short version is that the US legislation made ex-bourbon casks much easier to obtain and quite a bit cheaper than other casks such as those from sherry or wine bodegas. The bourbon casks are charred before their first use. That basically means they're set on fire before any spirit is added. The charring helps to start the breakdown of one of the components in the oak, known as lignin. That can help reduce any sulphury notes in the whisky and also helps to extract the vanillin from the cask, and that's the ideal compound that gives you the sweet vanilla notes that lots of distillers crave. Charring also helps to increase the production of whisky lactones, which can bring fruity and some of those coconutty flavours to the spirit. Sherry casks, by comparison, tend to be toasted, not charred. That means they're a little less effective at removing sulphury or immature aromas, and that can lead to a heavier or even a more meatier style of whisky with more colour and greater astringency. Of course, the variety of sherry also plays a huge part depending on whether the cask contained Oloroso, Pedro Ximénez, or one of the other lighter varieties of sherry wine. It is possible to use new casks known as virgin oak to mature Scotch, but most distillers prefer to use a cask where the harshness of the wood has already been tempered by maturing a different spirit beforehand. The canny folk running in Scotland's distilleries will also use a cask more than once, so you can look out on the label for whether it says first fill, meaning it's the first time it's been used to mature whisky, or second fill, meaning it's already been used to mature two separate whiskies. When you see the term refill on the label, it could mean the cask has been used more than twice. It's not a good thing or a bad thing, you just need to think of the cask's impact as a bit like using a tea bag repeatedly. It starts off pretty powerful, but gets weaker each time you use it. But for long periods of maturation, sometimes you don't want the cask to have too much of a woody influence on the whisky, so something like a second fill cask can be ideal for that kind of lengthy maturation. Whatever casks distillers use, their use is heavily protected by the industry guardian, that's the Scotch Whisky Association. It basically makes sure that the tradition and character of Scotch whisky is preserved and that everyone is working within the same rules. So when it comes to maturation, these rules specifically stipulate that new make spirit needs to go into casks made of oak, but that could be any species, and there are distinct differences, for example, between American oak, known as Quercus alba, and European oak, Quercus robur. Also, the cask can't be any bigger than 700 litres in size. The whisky needs to mature in the cask for a minimum of 3 years, as we said. And also, very importantly, nothing can be added to enhance the flavour. So there's no sloshing in a bucket of Oloroso sherry to help it on its way, or throwing some oak chips into the cask, as sometimes happens in the wine industry. What many whisky makers do though is to move the contents of one cask for another period of additional maturation. It's become more and more popular, and it's also something that we celebrate here at the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. Check the label on your bottle and you'll see it's quite common that one of our whiskies has spent a number of years in an ex-bourbon hogshead, for example, followed by around 2 years in an ex-sherry cask like this one. Why do we do it? It's because that period of additional maturation can bring extra layers of flavour and different characteristics to the whisky. And the beauty of maturation is that it can take something made with these 3 basic ingredients and it can offer up an endless variety of characteristics in your whisky. And because wood is a natural and unpredictable material, every cask is unique in its own way. It's like a moment captured in time. And the whisky bottled by us at the Scotch Malt Whisky Society celebrates this individuality. The beauty of maturation is that it can take something made with these 3 basic ingredients and it can offer up an endless variety of characteristics in your whisky. And because wood is a natural and unpredictable material, every cask is going to be unique in its own way, a moment captured in time and then bottled by the Scotch Malt Whisky Society as a complete one-off. Although this feels like quite a lot to take in, it's really only scraping the surface of each cask type and its influence over the spirit's maturation. So let us know if you'd like us to take a deeper dive into each of these individual cask types and its specific impact on how it matures the whisky. Another thing you'll tend to find popping up around whisky bars and on bottle labels are the Scotch whisky regions. They usually give an implication as to how a whisky should taste based on where the distillery is located. But why do people have preconceptions about how a whisky should taste purely based on where it's from? And is there actually any rationale behind them? Why not uncover the hidden truth about the Scotch whisky regions? Until next time, enjoy your whisky, Slange.